This is the third of a three-part series with the question, are Jewish views of Jesus changing? Part one of the series dealt with the original separation and how the followers of Jesus, or Yeshua, ended up separating from their Jewish brethren. Part two dealt with those who are living in the borderlands and who are living in the areas where the church and the synagogue say no one should live there. Part three, we're going to be taking a look at academic reevaluation of Yeshua in the Jewish world. Many might think that if Jewish people start having an interest in Yeshua, that it would happen in the synagogue. But historically what has happened is in the university there has been an interest in examining who Yeshua is by Jewish scholars that's been really intriguing. Since the Enlightenment, the Jewish academic world has moved Jewish attitude and thought significantly, particularly as it relates to Yeshua. Dr. Donald Hagner recognizes and traces the shift towards a more positive Jewish attitude toward Yeshua in his analysis of the modern Jewish study of Jesus. He writes, "It is my contention that all of these writers share to some extent in the enterprise known as the Jewish reclamation of Jesus, and furthermore there is a recognizable pattern in what they say concerning topics before us. Despite the differences among these writers, there is general agreement on many fundamental points. The similarity of outlook is so evident that it becomes possible to speak of a composite Jewish perspective to which each of these writers has contributed in his own way." Arthur Kack, in the edited anthology, The Messiahship of Jesus, surveys positive contemporary quotes on Yeshua from a broad range of Jewish scholars. For those seeking an introduction to important scholars wrestling with this topic, Kack provides it. During the 19th century, liberal Jewish scholars and rabbis were attempting to create a new Judaism which would engage the nations around them and fit into the modern industrial world. Some of these scholars started to investigate Yeshua's teaching. Some of these scholars involved in this inquiry included Joseph Salvador in France, Abraham Geiger in Germany, Claude Montefiore in England, and Kaufmann Kohler, Isaac Meyer Weiss, and Joseph Krauskopf in America. These primarily focused on the historical Jesus. There was an unexpected adoption in their scholarship as they argued to Christianity that Judaism was the religion of Jesus. Rather than finding a Gentile God in the New Testament, these scholars found that much of what Yeshua taught fit into the Jewish cultural milieu of the biblical prophets and the proto-rabbinic Judaism of the first century of the Common Era. Yeshua's parables and moral teachings found such a good fit in the Jewish culture that Jewish liberal scholars came to a greater place of trust in the authenticity of the gospel accounts than many of their contemporary Christian academic scholars. The teachings of Jesus became to be viewed as distinct from Christianity, with the embrace of Yeshua being understood as possible, even if they continued to have problems with their Christian neighbors. As archaeology would discover more about the first century of the Common Era and the Jewish world of the Mediterranean, Yeshua would continue to fit in more and more. Some Jewish scholars were quick to point out parallels from Yeshua's teachings to Jewish rabbis whose works would be committed to writing hundreds of years later. This was sometimes presented as Yeshua not being unique, but simply another local teacher. Others, like Claude Montefiore, argued Yeshua had made a significant and unique contribution. Montefiore, in his treatment of the lost sheep and the lost coin in Luke 15, says, "This verse sums up one of the specific characteristics of Jesus and one of the new excellences of the gospel. The sinners drew near him. Surely this is a new note, something we have not heard in the Old Testament of its heroes, something we do not hear in the Talmud of its heroes. The sinners drew near to him. His teaching did not repel them. It did not palter with or make light of sin, yet it gave comfort to the sinner. The virtues of repentance are gloriously praised in the rabbinical literature, but this direct search for and appeal to the sinner are new and moving notes of high import and significance. Shalom ben Chorin, an émigré from Germany to Israel in the 1930s, evaluated the areas Jewish scholars found easy acceptance of the gospel, while also identifying the problem areas for Jewish scholars accepting the gospel testimony. As Ben Chorin wrote in the late 1960s, whether one examines the historians or the representatives of belles lettres, one discovers that the modern Jewish image is far more positive than the medieval image. Not only is the historicity of Jesus rarely denied, but much more of the gospel material, particularly the synoptics, is readily accepted. Jesus' preaching in parables and prayers, his nationalism, and the tragedy of his life and death are seen to be comprehensible only in a Jewish context. More problematic for the Jews are the gospel accounts of Jesus' birth and death and resurrection, as well as the special consciousness and power attributed to him. As Israel was established as a state, the establishment of a Jewish homeland provided an even greater stability to Jewish scholars, giving them opportunity to approach Yeshua. Ben Chorin continues by setting up his introduction to the study of Yeshua. He ends the first chapter of Brother Jesus with the following observation. Jesus of Nazareth lived. He continues to live, not only in the church that rests on him, or more precisely in the many churches and denominations that claim him, but also in his Jewish people, whose martyrdom he embodies. Is not the suffering Jesus, the Jesus scorned as he hangs dying on the cross, a likeness for his entire people who, tortured and bloodied, have been hanged time and again on the cross of anti-Semitism? And is the Easter message of the resurrection not a parable for post-war Israel, which has risen out of the abasement and disgrace of the darkest 12 years in its history to a new incarnation? Jacob Yach describes the relationship between Ben Chorin and Jesus not as an academic exercise, but as an encounter which is not an easy one. Yach points out that both Buber and Ben Chorin see Jesus as a central figure in Jewish history. The argument between them is framed, I am sure that he will continue to wrestle with me as long as I have life, and that he will continue to meet me as, according to a legend, he met Peter on the Via Appia, and as according to the witness of the Apostle Paul, he met him on the road to Damascus. This is no longer an academic, but an existential challenge. But it is not a challenge to faith. It is rather a confrontation, in Leo Bayak's words, with the witness of the Jewish history of faith. Ben Chorin confesses that since he left Christian Europe for Israel, Jesus has been drawing even closer to him than ever before. As Yach points out, that Buber regarded Yeshua in a similar fashion to Ben Chorin, it's best for us to hear Buber's words for himself. From my youth onward, I have found Jesus my great brother. That Christianity has regarded and does regard him as God and Savior has always appeared to me to be a fact of the highest importance, which, for his sake and for my own, I must endeavor to understand. My own fraternally open relationship to him has grown ever stronger and clearer, and today I see him more strongly and clearly than ever before. I am more than ever certain that a great place belongs to him in Israel's history of faith, and that this place cannot be described by any of the usual categories. Giza Vermes is well known for his scholarship regarding the Dead Sea Scrolls. He weighed in as another voice on Yeshua, one who operated as a Jewish historian. His study emphasized the importance of treating Yeshua in a historical context coming out of the Galilean milieu. His conclusion in Jesus the Jew argues, indeed, if this present research has any value at all, it is in the conclusion that it is most likely to reside, since it means that any new inquiry may accept as its point of departure the safe assumption that Jesus did not belong among the Pharisees, Essenes, Zealots, or Gnostics, but he was one of the holy miracle workers of Galilee. The discovery of the resemblance between the work and words of Jesus and those of the Hasidim, Honi and Hananiah ben Dosa, is by no means intended to imply that he was simply one of them and nothing more. Although no systematic attempt is made here to distinguish Jesus' authentic teaching, this is an enormous task that will, it is hoped, be undertaken on another occasion. It is nevertheless still possible to say, even in the absence of such an investigation, that no objective and enlightened student of the Gospels can help but be struck by the incomparable superiority of Jesus. Dr. David Flusser, an Orthodox Jew, writes from a position of belief and profound faith as he encounters Yeshua in the New Covenant Scriptures. There are points of critical reading, redaction, and at times dismissal of sections of the synoptic gospel accounts of Yeshua in Flusser's work, but he is more conservative with the text, as he points out in the preface of The Sage from Galilee, than many Christian scholars. There continues to be a core trust in Yeshua's ministry, even as Flusser stands just short of affirming belief in Yeshua's incarnation. Believers in Yeshua who encounter the sage from Galilee tend to ask if David Flusser was a secret believer in Yeshua, so deep was his devotional encounter in the gospel texts. As a further affirmation of Flusser's investment in this endeavor, his testimony is found in the preface of The Sage from Galilee. He writes, I readily admit that I personally identify myself with Jesus' Jewish worldview, both moral and political. I believe that in the content of his teachings and the approach he embraced have always had the potential to change our world and prevent the greatest part of evil and suffering. What I have set out to do here is to illuminate and interpret, at least in part, Jesus' person and opinions within the framework of his time and people. My ambition is simply to serve as a mouthpiece for Jesus' message today. Dr. Pinchas Lapid, in his book, The Resurrection of Jesus, A Jewish Perspective, writes from the perspective of an Orthodox Jew of the necessity of the resurrection of Yeshua to have taken place, to explain the subsequent history of the apostolic courage and the explosive spread of faith in Yeshua. Lapid carefully looks at the historical impact which grew from the claimed resurrection and considers if there could have been any other way the same impact could have been generated in Israel and the surrounding countries. Lapid explains his process of coming to the conclusion outlined in The Resurrection of Jesus as he writes, In regard to the future resurrection of the dead, I am and remain a Pharisee. Concerning the resurrection of Jesus on Easter Sunday, I was for decades a Sadducee. I am no longer a Sadducee, since the following deliberation has caused me to think this through anew. When this scared, frightened band of apostles, which was just about to throw away everything in order to flee in despair to Galilee, when these peasants, shepherds, and fishermen who betrayed and denied their master and then failed him miserably, suddenly could be changed overnight into a confident missionary society, convinced of salvation and able to work with much more success after Easter than before Easter, then no vision or hallucination is sufficient to explain such a revolutionary transformation. Be that as it may, something must have happened which we can designate as a historical event, since its results were historical, although we are completely unable to comprehend the exact nature of the occurrence. For all these Christians who believe in the incarnation, something I am unable to do, but have difficulty with the historically understood resurrection, the words of Jesus of the blind guides straining out a gnat and swallowing a camel probably applies. Again, the issue of the incarnation seems to be the sticking point for Lapide. Modern Christian academic treatments of Yeshua are hard-pressed to avoid addressing the Jewish cultural background in contemporary studies. To provide comprehensive proof of Jewish influence in the modern Christian theological views of Yeshua would go far past the boundaries of this video. But the two following quotes give an idea of how mainstream Yeshua's Jewishness now is. Dr. Craig Keener, in The Historical Jesus of the Gospels, writes, I prefer a more specifically Jewish context for studying Jesus historically, not because I have not studied the other sources, but for two methodological reasons. First, Jesus was a Galilean Jew for whom Palestinian Jewish sources provide the closest cultural context. Second, as I've inductively worked through the ancient literature over the years, I often found much closer Palestinian Jewish parallels to Yeshua's speech and actions, sometimes down to a turn of a phrase, than in other sources. Dr. Brad Young, a student of David Flusser, establishes a viewpoint in Jesus the Jewish theologian which would have been shocking in a previous generation coming from a Christian theologian. Most certainly, Jesus did not begin by rejecting Judaism. He is a Jewish theologian. Jesus is inextricably linked to his people and their faith. To understand Jesus, we must learn to love his people and his religion. He came not to destroy, but to fulfill. With the growing acceptance of Yeshua in the Jewish academic world, it is not surprising that some Jewish scholars are rereading Shaul, the Apostle Paul, and finding him to also belong to the Jewish world. The work of Mark Nanos, Pamela Eisenbaum, and others are opening up new ways to view Shaul. With new perspectives on Yeshua and Shaul, there is also a new appraisal of those who have lived in the borderlands. While some are still repeating traditional slogans, others are suggesting new paradigms. Michael Weisgrad, an Orthodox Jew who has worked in Jewish-Christian relations over his academic career, challenged a Jewish cardinal of the Roman Catholic Church to live as a devout Jew, just as the apostles had. Weisgrad wrote a public letter to Cardinal Lustiger challenging him to live as a Torah-observant cardinal in the context of the Roman Catholic Church. Weisgrad's challenge to the cardinal is to return back to Christianity's primitive and biblical roots in order to reestablish the lost middle ground. Weisgrad challenged Lustiger to go further than just simply identify with his Jewish background, but to establish ongoing practice which would identify him with Torah and with living Jews. Weisgrad outlines an Acts 15-based theology which would be familiar to most Messianic Jews. He urged the cardinal, the verdict of the First Jerusalem Council, then, is that the church is to consist of two segments united by their faith in Jesus. However, with respect to the Mosaic Law, Jewish Christians would remain under it, while Gentile Christians would come under the Noahide commandments. But if I am right, are you not, from the Christian point of view, obligated to lead a Torah-observant life because you are a Jew? Are you not obligated to obey the dietary laws, the Sabbath, the Jewish festivals, etc.? The contemporary Messianic Jewish world agrees with much of Weisgrad's New Covenant interpretation and understanding. but these are border dwellers. But what's more shocking is this is an Orthodox Jew calling a Christian back to Jewish roots. There's much more to share about the borderlands. There's far more activity in this region than many believe. This presentation does not suggest that all Christians or Jews like what is going on. In fact, many are uncomfortable with this, and others are firmly opposed to what has been shared from both traditional camps. This lack of comfort can be described as follows. Jack Miles, author and former Jesuit seminarian, describes a conversation which illustrates both the Jewish and Christian discomfort with Boyarin. Daniel Boyarin, a prominent conservative rabbi, confided to me not long ago, is one of the 2 or 3 greatest rabbinic scholars in the world and, dropping his voice a notch, possibly even the greatest. The observation was given in confidence because quite clearly it troubled the rabbi to think that someone with Boyarin's views might have truly learned Talmudic grounds for them. As a Christian, let me confide that his views can be equally troubling for Christians who appreciate the equally grounded originality of his reading of our New Testament. Boyarin's is a troubling brilliance because it blurs and complicates a pair of reciprocally settled identities. His achievement is to have taken conceptual control of this reciprocity and then deployed it in a bold rereading of the rabbis and the evangelists alike, the result of which are so startling that once you Jew or you Christian, get what he is up to, you suddenly read even the most familiar passage of your home scriptures in a new light. Is God behind this? Is this an anomaly, or is this the future? What could possibly happen next? Rav Shaul speaks in Romans 11 of there being a gathering of the Jews and the believers in Yeshua together. He talks about this as the great eschatological event. Franz Rosenwig presents a vision which seems very close to Rav Shaul's when he says, Judaism is oriented inward to the Jews, whereas Christianity is facing outward to the Gentiles. In fact, Christianity is Judaism for the Gentiles. Israel stays with God. Christianity goes out into the world to bring the unredeemed peoples to the God of Israel. Christianity's function is well symbolized by the cross, the vertical beam of which looks heavenward to God, and the horizontal beam is outstretched toward mankind. Only in the end time, when the task of mankind's redemption will have been completed, will Judaism and Christianity fuse into one faith. Could we be close?